Now, our keynote speech today will be presented by Dr. John Hope. The topic is Looking into the Future, the Importance of Internationalization for Taiwan Teachers. Let's welcome Dr. John Hope.
Thank you, Vivian. Thank you very much. Kia ora.
Kia ora.
That's good. All the people who are here who have been to New Zealand know what kia ora is about. So thank you very much for coming along to listen to me. I would have thought that people had probably heard enough from me when they were in New Zealand. So I'm very impressed that you and very appreciative of the fact that you asked me to come along and talk to you today. So I need some help to read this screen to go on to full screen. Can somebody just tell me how to do that in Mandarin? Great, thank you, Vivian. That's great. Okay, so this is me, and I've got a bit less than an hour to talk with you. So I'm going to talk about two things. One is the wider issues about internationalization in the world today, not with a specific focus on Taiwan, but on the world. And then I'm going to focus on Taiwan teachers. So we will have time for questions at the end, I hope. So for those of you who don't know, New Zealand is at the top of the world. It is. And that means that you're at the bottom of the world. And so this is what we teach our children in New Zealand, of course, that they belong to the top of the world. And I've just come from a small country, well, small population-wise, as those of you who've been to New Zealand know. But when I come to Taipei, I find you have so many people. And it's just a big change for me coming from a place where we don't have very many people. And my presentation outline is just a picture, because the picture says, there is a saying, a picture can give 1,000 words. And the focus of the picture is little children. And you'll see the reason for this picture later on, because I'm going to go back to these little children towards the end. So a little bit about my background for those of you who may not know, although most of the audience here does know who I am. But I've been around for quite a long time, and as a result I've been to many countries and many parts of the world. And this is, I think, my third trip to Taiwan. So I'm really looking forward to renewing acquaintances here. But in the end, my job has been to work with children, to work with teachers, to work with schools and universities all around the world. So I've been very privileged in my background, and something that I am always going to be very happy about, because it's kept me in touch with what I think is the most important subject in the world, which is education. So let's move on. Auckland, just very briefly, this is the picture for those of you who haven't been, and for those of you who have, a reminder. So it's half the size of Taipei, but it's what we call a big city. But if you want to come, because 20% Asian, you can buy all your Asian food there. And it's a top-ranked university. It's highly ranked. The new ranking we just got is the third last one there. #1 in the world for impact, for higher education, impact and sustainability. It's a new award for Times higher education, and we got #1, so we're very appreciative of that. So we're the Faculty of Education, and that's where my home is. And this is the part where I'm going to talk about higher education in the world and internationalization. So just going through these bullet points, I'm sure you can all read English, so I won't spend a lot of time on each of them. But I want you to realise the importance of internationalisation. 5 million international students and rising. $300 billion US to the economy. We often don't think of it in economical terms, but it is a very important part of the economy in most countries in the world now. And it's been exponential growth, although there have been, because of the political situation, some declines in some parts of the world. But it's changing. It's changing a lot. When I started working in universities and internationalisation, we used to get hundreds and hundreds of students from Malaysia. They didn't stay in Malaysia to complete their education system. Now, more students come from other countries to Malaysia than leave Malaysia to study. And I think that that's probably a similar situation that's what's happening in Taiwan now, because Taiwan is becoming more attractive to international students. And I see that as a very good thing, because it means that we are going to experience each other much more, we are going to have more time to learn to understand each other and to understand that difference is okay. Doesn't matter which country, which culture, which language we have, we are still citizens of this world, and we all need to perhaps look at number 6, the common good. The common good has been the driver of internationalisation, but in some countries, including my own, there has been, from some people, more of a focus on the economic side of it, which I think has to be acknowledged, but should not be emphasised. So what's happened? What's caused all this internationalisation? So you all know what globalisation is. I've been reading a little bit about Taiwan when I was coming over here in the plane, and there has been massive increase in internationalisation regarding Taiwan. You can't survive as a country without internationalisation. So in New Zealand, we buy quite a lot of Taiwanese things. I'm not sure if you, all of you know, but I have a hobby which I hope to do more of as I approach retirement. But the hobby is to make little model steam engines out of metal. And so I have to have machines. Now, many years ago when I started to do this, you could buy a machine made in the United States, or you could buy a machine made in Taiwan. If you bought the United States one, it would cost twice as much as the Taiwan one, but it would work properly forever, and the Taiwanese one would not. Now, the situation has reversed, because I just bought a new machine now, and I had to pay more to get a Taiwanese one. That is because Taiwan has moved from a third world economy into a first world. And now Taiwan focuses on quality. And other countries, like China, Vietnam, and so on, focus on the cheaper stuff. So now if I want to buy a metal lathe, and I buy one from Taiwan, I know it's going to be a good quality one. My brother, who lives in Vancouver, in Toronto in China, he saw what I was doing, wanted to do that, and he bought himself a Chinese lathe, and it's not very good. Because they are still coming up. Taiwan has been through that process. And that is the process of globalization, where countries share and buy and sell from each other, but increasingly depend on international relations for those things to happen. And increasingly in the world, quality matters, not just quantity. And so Taiwan has been through the process of being cheap, and now it's not so cheap because it is higher quality. But more people will go for higher quality. And if you look across the straits, you will see the opposite thing happening in China, where China's exports have declined because of low quality, and you can get it cheaper from Vietnam or Cambodia. So these things happen, and they're global things that we cannot control, but they affect education. So I was looking at your website, and I see your president has a very supportive statement about internationalisation. And he makes this statement that NTNU students should internationalise their learning through mobility and other forms of international engagement. Now, I think that that is real wisdom from your president. Not every university in the world would have the president making a statement like that. I think it's a really visionary statement because of the importance of internationalisation for every student in Taiwan, both in the universities and in the schools. So, continuing on with why higher education has changed, there is the short courses like you have been doing, and of course semester abroad studies. Semester abroad is in decline around the world, and that is due to problems with things like terrorism. Many families, the parents are not happy for their students to travel anymore because they're worried about terrorism in some countries. But increasingly, increasingly universities are perhaps moving to short courses in the way that your university has been doing. And I'd like to congratulate your professor for the work that she is doing to promote short course work like you have done. Short courses and internships are under massive growth because students aren't away for so long, and also it's cheaper. So that's the future for many people, and to see that being encouraged in the opening words this morning, I think is wonderful, because to me that's the future for Taiwan and New Zealand. Another thing that's changed, of course, is technology, and technology has a massive effect on universities. When I started looking into that, I had to write a chapter for a book about the future of internationalisation and technology. And when I started to look into it, there were futurists who were predicting the death of brick and mortar universities, like this one, like my one. They were saying that in the future, we will not be going to a place. We will be doing everything online. That was a future prediction about 5 years ago. It's still bricks and mortar here. It's bricks and mortar in my university, and I think that will be the same for as long as I can be around. So you'll probably be aware of MOOCs, how they were going to take over the world, but they haven't. MOOCs are very good. I can do a MOOC that helps me to learn how to use my new machine. I could do a MOOC to learn how to do something about nuclear physics, but I won't do a degree on a MOOC, and nor is anybody really. So the online growth has been in interest, personal development rather than university degrees. However, I've just been speaking at a conference in Japan 3 weeks ago, and one of the keynote presenters there was a professor from a robotics institute. Well, it's probably one of the top ones in the world, I understand, where they're developing robotics for education, which I was not aware of. And it was a very fascinating, eye-opening presentation that he did. And he showed kindergarten children an experiment that they are doing with robotics in kindergartens. Basically, they have a robot that looks like a big cuddly person, and each child has one. And they did an experiment, the education people did an experiment with gaining kindergarten's children's attention and increasing the length of their attention. And they showed instruction happening without the robot, and they showed instruction happening with the same students with the robot. And each child was sitting on the floor cuddling this thing, which is a robot, but it's soft and cuddly. And what happened? The attention span with the robots was enormous. I could not believe kindergarten children could concentrate for that long. And all the research that I've read about attention span for preschool children is that it's very short. They were sitting still and listening and learning for like 3/4 of an hour, completely engrossed, because of this robot talking to them and holding against them. And I thought, wow, how impressive was that? They also showed another experiment where they did the same thing with old people with dementia in a hospital, and how very difficult. I'm not sure if you know about dementia, but it's an increasing problem in the world for old people. So people like me get worried about dementia, so we read about that. And it is a problem where people can't communicate. People don't understand when someone comes to see them that it might be their son or their daughter. They don't recognise them. They can't communicate. But they had this huggy, they called it a huggy robot thing for the old people. And the old people would talk to it like it was a person and relate to it, because it was warm and cuddly, and they held it like that, sitting in their wheelchairs. And it allowed them to communicate. And so I want to just say to you that number 5 there is something for the future to be considered. If you think about what's happened to you in your lifetime, you will have seen massive change. I've seen more than probably all of you because of my age. Massive change. I don't know what the future's going to bring, but I do think that we need to be aware of things like robotics, because robotics are something that's taking over the business world and taking over in the world of industry, and I don't think it's going to be very long before we see robotics in education. In your lifetime, those of you who are teachers here. And so you need to be aware that these changes, which you might never have heard about or might never have imagined, could be happening in your school in your time. And that's something that we need to think about when we are teaching children. And it's all happening through internationalisation. And this is what I was been referring to. The students that you have in your school now are different. They are different from you. They are very different from me. I'm what's called a baby boomer. So I was born, my father was a soldier fighting in the Second World War. When he came back, he married my mother, and boom, I came out 1 year later. And so I was the first of what's called the baby boomers. And the baby boomers are the children who arrived after the Second World War. And of course, my parents lived through a major economic depression in the 30s, 1930s, and then experienced war. Their parents experienced war. So I was the first generation who did not experience war, and that made some changes to me. So I'm different from my mother and father. You are different from your mothers and fathers, because you have lived through a digital age that probably many of your mothers and fathers have experienced in their lifetime. Certainly when I was a young child, we didn't imagine a thing called a computer. We couldn't even imagine a TV. We didn't even have a proper telephone. That's happened in my lifetime. You have seen the introduction of social media, which I didn't ever envisage we could do. it was science fiction to talk on a mobile phone. That's all science fiction. Every one of you has probably got your phone there and you're keeping an eye on it. That is a change that has happened to you. What is going to happen to the next generation? Can you imagine? Very few of us can predict the future, but we can get some idea about how to deal with the future. But one of the things that's come through from the Generation Z research that's going on in the world is that they don't necessarily think that they would go through the same lifestyle of education as you have. So more and more they want to have something that is for them, not just something that's been traditional. So, for example, the thought of just going to one university for a degree is increasingly under challenge. People might want to take something from one university, something from another university, something from a university in one country, and something from a university in another country. And that is going to affect the staff at this university, and it's going to affect the staff at my university, and it's going to affect you as teachers. So people are going to more and more demand something geared towards the future. And that is something that often is harder for universities to deal with because universities tend to be very traditional places. So the changes that have happened that I can see in my life, for example, making money. When I was the age of leaving school and thought about making money, I never imagined that I could become rich. People didn't become rich when I was young. Now, the girl in that picture, whose name is Lord, a New Zealand singer, is a multi-millionaire at 17 years of age. #1 in the United States. I could never have imagined that happening when I was young. We have another New Zealand girl, Lydia Ko, who was the top female golfer in the world when she was 17 years old. And again, multi-millionaire now. That didn't happen before. We have 2 high school students from my university, just left high school and just first year in the university, who are multi-millionaires because they've set up an online system for helping students get into top universities around the world, like Yale, Harvard and Oxford. They have become multi-millionaires in their first year at university. That could never have happened in my lifetime, previous to now. So the children who are at school with you, one of them could be doing something like that. You just don't know what's going to happen in the future, and the way to earn money can be very different, which means people want very different education. So some more changes. Bureaucrats have taken over the world in universities, and that has meant that sometimes universities have focused more on economics and more on the business side than on academic research. And that is something that many of us older professors feel very concerned about. And that in turn affects internationalisation and the education that children can have. So sometimes curriculum is decided for economic considerations rather than the greater good of the students. And I'm not sure if that happens here. I don't know enough about Taiwan, but it's certainly happening in most Western universities, and that is of concern. And this is the result. So you get internationalisation statements on websites which say lovely things. which say all the things that internationalisation is all about. However, what's happening in some countries is this. They are not focusing on the greater good, they are focusing on other agendas, all or some of the things that I have listed there. And I don't think that that is ideal, but it is the reality of the world today. So one of the things that I'm going to talk about now is the common good, what you can do for your students to try and overcome some of these more negative things. So here are the threats that we've got to look at. So we've got increasing dollar costs. We've got limited opportunities to obtain work in some countries. So people get concerned about that when they're having their education. We've got the issue of terrorism I mentioned before, extreme nationalism. Spying has now become an issue, which I had never imagined would happen in universities. We've got some racial, religious and political issues causing barriers for international students. Funding being an issue. More recently, particularly in countries, less developed countries like in Africa, there is concern that Western countries and some Asian countries are becoming what's called educational colonialism, in other words, trying to make the country the same as their country. And that is something which is of concern as well. And increasing economic inequality resulting from globalisation, rich getting richer, poor getting poorer. So one of the concerns for me is to see if we can stop that. So here are some things that I want you to think about before we talk about specifics of your own students. So these are issues that I see from my research and reading that are facing internationalisation in the future. Artificial intelligence. Have you ever given any thought to whether artificial intelligence will take over your job? Because that is the prediction for many, many, many jobs. We've just had at my university a think tank thinking about whether we should be teaching accounting anymore, because apparently accountants are likely to be extinct in 10 years' time. Already people are moving on to, certainly New Zealand is moving this way, where you just buy an online accounting package. You do not have an accountant. So accountancy is not necessarily a good degree to do anymore. So we are wondering whether we should be teaching that in the university. Will the bevy of new ultra-nationalist and protectionist political leaders, what will that do to internationalisation? We've got leaders in several countries around the world who are very, very anti-internationalisation, both in trade and in education. And I worry about that. Movement of refugees. We get a lot of refugees moving to New Zealand. And if you have been to Europe recently, you'll see the massive issues that there are in Europe, the Middle East, and in some African countries. Those sorts of things, or in South America now, of course. So these things can affect education. What happens if you suddenly get a student, as I have had when I was a student from Cambodia, come into my classroom who couldn't speak a word of English, who was blind because she had been shot in the head, who had no teeth because she had been starved, and who had seen her mother and father killed in front of her. And she came into my classroom and all she could do was smile, even though she had no teeth. And that was a big lesson to me about some things that happen in the world. And although that was a long time ago, in the Khmer Rouge time in that part of the world, those things happen and refugees leave and they could come into your classroom. And that is something, again, that can affect education for you. I might say that that student, in 2 years, she was 10 years old when she arrived, in 2 years became one of our top students. An absolutely brilliant young lady who never stopped smiling despite some of the most terrible things that had happened to her. And that's been a good lesson for me as well. So refugee movement is viewed negatively by many people, but can bring positive effects. And she's now one of our very good citizens in New Zealand. Climate change. Will you continue to fly internationally? Because many people now are wondering if they should, because of the amount of carbon that an aeroplane puts into the air. That has an effect on travel. I still came here, and I hope you will still fly, because I think the benefits outweigh the negatives, but it is an issue that will affect internationalisation. Some people won't internationalise because they don't want to fly. So the same for the green movement. Climate change, green movements, all part of the same thing. The new generation of students, what will their attitude be? I don't know what future generations will be, but certainly Generation Z are very international. 21st century skills. We all talk about them. Do you know what they are? Do you teach them in your class? Because your students aren't going to be using skills like I learned when I grew up and like you learned. They're going to be using different skills. And we should be acknowledging that and trying to imagine how to do something about that in our classrooms. I'll talk a little bit about that shortly. I spoke about robots, the Industrial Revolution 4. Do you know what Revolution 4 is? Well, it's going to affect everybody, just as the previous industrial revolutions have. And that is, again, something that we should be considering in our education system. And will education and work be increasingly integrated? One of the characteristics about Generation Z is that they value work-life mixing. They don't want to just be workers and spend their whole life devoted to that. They want some quality in their life. And that means a change to the education system. And we hope that knowledge diplomacy will improve harmony between nations. What you do when you came to New Zealand, or where you go somewhere else in the world, to Canada or any other country, you are part of knowledge diplomacy. You are sharing knowledge of your culture, of your background, of the strengths of your culture. For example, I love learning about Confucianism, because Confucius, in my opinion, was an exceptionally wise man, given how long it was ago. And I see evidence of Confucian sayings everywhere I come around in China and in Taiwan. And I think that's a good thing. But I don't see everybody living by Confucian ethics and moral values. So that is again where the sharing of those things needs to be spread. I would like New Zealand people to understand more about Confucianism, because they don't. In the same way that you have come to learn about some things about New Zealand or Canada or wherever you have been. So what does all this mean for teachers? So the first point is that most of the changes that are happening were not foreseen. So we must expect that change, not foreseen change, will continue. That's hard to deal with. The only constant we can be sure about is continued change. So we really have to think that change is going to continue. We cannot avoid it even though we don't like it. Most people don't like change. But if you think about it, how would you like to be as it was when I first got your age, most of you students? When I got married, I had 2 boys. And the oldest boy I wanted to internationalise. And I have German blood. So I said, I think I would like my son to go and spend some time at school in Germany. So when he was 14, he went to live in Germany and go to school there. The only way we had to communicate with him was a letter, a handwritten letter, which took something like 6 weeks to get there. So my wife, who's a very typical mother, worried, did not want him to go. And we did not know he was still alive for weeks and weeks and weeks, because we had to wait for a letter. And I have to say, he wasn't a good letter writer, so we had to wait a very long time to know that he was still alive. We could have made a phone call, but it was difficult, and sometimes difficult to go across languages. So we were relying on letters. Now, if any of you are married, and I know some of you are, and you have children, maybe they will go offshore, you can talk to them every day or every night that you want to, because you have a mobile phone. I didn't have that. Now that's a massive change, that although we see some bad things about mobile phones, people are increasingly getting neck problems because they're walking around like this all the time. People are getting eyesight problems because of too much looking at close to mobile phones. These are medical changes that are happening in the world now. However, or perhaps the other big one, of course, is the issues of things like bullying, things like dependence on virtual friends rather than face-to-face friends. These are negative things. The positive thing is that if I was younger now and my son went to Germany, I could talk to him every day. So we have positives and negatives about every change, and that will happen with the future changes, positives and negatives. So to my mind, your job is to prepare your students for that, to prepare your students for change, to be able to understand that change has both negative and positive components. So, some suggestions. The first one is to prepare yourself. You have to see yourself as a model for your children, students in your classes. And so you must prepare yourself as best you can. And I think continuing to study lifelong is a really, really important thing. I've been talking to Melissa because when she was in New Zealand, she was trying to get her master thesis finished. And she used to stay after classes and work on her thesis. And I was very impressed with that. But it's part of what I see as people should be doing, lifelong learning. You can see how old I am. I'm still enrolled in a course. You might not appreciate that. It's a course to do with my hobby. I'm doing on a MOOC, but it's lifelong learning. And I will still do that until I don't wake up in the morning one day. Because to me, it's keeping me alive. And when I say alive, I mean alert, I mean interested, I mean enjoying life. And learning is the best way to do that. It doesn't matter what you're learning about, as long as you're continuing to stimulate your mind, you will appreciate the need to stimulate the mind of your students. So that's one thing that you can do. Continue to learn. It doesn't matter if you are learning something nothing to do with education. It is continuing to learn. and you will pass that model on to your students. Keeping up to date with international events beyond Taiwan. That's absolutely critical. Increasingly in the world today, research tells us that students don't know about anything outside their own country. Students in surveys around the world can't recognise geography. They don't know even where countries are. It's quite common for us, of course, because I live in such a small country so far away, for particularly American people to think we're part of Australia. And we hate that, because we don't want to be part of Australia. But that's what American people think. It's way over there, it's a small country. The only one they know about is Australia, so they asked me if we've got kangaroos. Well, we don't. We're a different country. So people might think the same thing about Taiwan. I don't know. I didn't know about Taiwan when I was a youngster. I do now. I've appreciated a lot about Taiwan in recent times, but it's only through internationalisation that I've learned about Taiwan. You need to keep up to date with what's happening around the world, because the political situations that change all the time, as you can read in the news anytime, those things affect our students. They affect us and our students. Travel. Despite the green and pollution issues and so on, I do think travel is critical. So either study travel or holiday travel. Take your family, take your children overseas. My son, who went to Germany, will tell you that it was the best to him. It made him turn into a man. He learned to be independent. We sent him because we thought it was good to learn the language and to experience another culture. What we didn't see was the different young man that came back. And he will tell you that that was a very motivating part of his life. He's now 46 years old, and he still has a friend in Germany that he communicates with from when he was 14. And I think that's a really wonderful thing. So what about your strengths and areas of interest? I've told you what I like to do, and most of you also know I like to play golf. 3 weeks ago I played golf in Japan with the president of the university there. Fabulous. Very different. And he beat me. But anyway, that was beside the point. The point is I'm following up my hobbies, my interests, and I think that's making me a more interesting person. And that president's now coming to New Zealand to play golf with me in 2 months' time. So that's a great thing that's come out of internationalisation for me. You might not be into golf or into making model steam engines, but whatever it is, make your hobby evident to your students. I think I told this story to the students when they were with me, but I had a student of mine when I was a classroom teacher of 11-year-olds come back to me recently with an award that he won in the United States for designing the cockpit for the Boeing Dreamliner enormous aeroplane that many of we fly on right now. And he got the airline pilots gave him the award for the top cockpit of an aeroplane. And he got, I think, $250,000 award. And he bothered to find out about me and send back a message to me to say he wanted to thank me because I put him on the path to the job that he now has. And I was very impressed with that, and it was amazing, and I couldn't imagine how I had done that. But he told me, he said, I taught a unit on flight and got him interested in aeroplanes when he was at primary school. And that led him to what he now does. And what actually, I came here on a Dreamliner. So I'm appreciating his work all the time. You see, you don't know what your influence will be in the future. You just don't know. So, some more suggestions very quickly. You need to expose your students to change, including change in the way you teach. You need to unsettle them a little bit. You need to help them to see that change is inevitable, and learning to deal with change is a good thing. It's quite a big change for children to leave their mother and go to school. I don't know if you can remember that happening to you, but certainly my wife was a new entrant teacher for many years, and I saw children finding that change very difficult. But there is even more change coming in our lives, and we have to prepare students for that by giving them little changes. Little changes, learning to adjust to them, change in schedule, how do you deal with it? Prepare your students to think for themselves, to take responsibility. When I was a school principal, I got the new entrant teacher, that's the teacher of 5-year-olds, which is, we start school in New Zealand at 5 years of age on their birth date. In their first week at school, I asked the new entrant teacher to send the students to me, the principal, to come and show me their book. And it gave them responsibility. It gave them the opinion that they mattered. And many parents commented about the fact that their child came home and couldn't stop talking about the fact that they went to see the principal. Of course, I gave them something sweet to eat, of course, as a reward. But at the same time, the important thing was they were given stature. They were given responsibility. They were seen as equal. And you need to do that for your students, I think. And expose them to different people in the community, old people, people with handicap, visitors. The more you can expose them to difference, the better. You have your own indigenous culture people here, as we have in New Zealand with our Maori people. That should be part of all students' upbringing. It's important to realise that difference is okay, and that meeting and talking with people can help people to understand that. So some more suggestions preparing for the future. Love your students. I think this is a number one thing. If you can care for them, really care for them. Education is about what you learn in your head, but it should be also what's in your heart. And if children feel accepted and loved, then they are more likely to see you as a model and accept the learning that you provide for them. Taking them to visits outside their experience, even close by. Many students haven't been to the same places that you have, or have only been to places that their parents frequent. Have high expectations for your students. There's very good research to say that the more you expect from your students, the more you'll get. If you see students as being not able, not so clever, they will be not so clever. If you can help them to see their potential, they will rise to that. Allow them to experiment, to try different things in the way that you teach. Instead of telling them everything, teach them to ask questions. That's the number one thing to do, because it's only by questions that we learn to think. So experimenting is critical. Experimenting is asking questions. And allow them to take some chances. You can do that in a physical way with sports and so on, but what about emotionally? What about taking chances in an environment that's a little different from what you might normally have every day, which is what internationalisation is all about. So, time's up, and I want to just go back to the very first slide I showed you with the picture of the children. So this is my grandson Thomas. He's special to me because he was the first grandson, and what's his middle name? It's John. So I'm very proud of my Thomas John Hope. He's now 5. he's in school now, but I love this picture of him because he's a real cute little boy. And he's very smart too. He just got the prize for the top 5-year-old. My wife it's the end of semester, end of term in New Zealand right now. And he just got the award. He had a graduation cap on because he graduated from the 5-year-old class and got the top award. And my wife sent me a picture while I've been away. I was sad to miss that. So what I'm saying is the future is this little boy. For me, that's what I'm dedicated to now, and what you should be dedicated to with your students. I believe in the importance of internationalisation for educators, because educators can change the world for opening their students' eyes to understand and accept difference. I think that really sums it all up. When you were here, those of you who are in New Zealand, you know when I was talking to you, I kept telling you, it's not better, it's not worse, it's just different. It's just different. And difference is okay. Difference makes the world interesting. We don't all want to be the same. So I've presented some background into my view about internationalisation. I don't expect everyone to agree with everything I said. That's part of being an academic. We should encourage debate. But I do believe that the future is international for you and for your students. I do believe that change is inevitable, and you have to help your students to be prepared for that, even though you have no idea what that change could be. So think international, and there's my challenge to you. Go home, educate your student or students, either your children, for me it's my grandchildren, educate them for a better international world future. I would like the world to be better for Thomas John Hope than it is right now. And I hope that you'll help me to do that. Thank you.